Hey friends, I'm Viktoria Harrison and welcome to this episode of The Branded Startup. In this video, I'm super excited to talk to you about my favorite topic of all time, and that is the power of story when it comes to building your brand. So I'm sure you've heard this said a lot of times. Your brain is wired for story. You know, in the last 10 years or so, there's just been an explosion of content online about this topic, especially in the business world. And I think that's because companies are truly trying to figure out how to get their message across in a world where there is more information coming at our brain than at any other time in history. There's a man named Kendall Havens. He's a storyteller and a scientist, and he conducted a lot of experiments on the human brain, watching the imagery of the brain as people were being told information. Some of the information was just raw data and some of the information was stories. And here's what he found. It's fascinating. He found that the human brain, in fact, only can receive and retain information when it is in the form of a story. And if it is not in the form of a story, the human brain will take raw data, and in order for the brain to make sense of it, it will turn it into a story. And if it cannot turn it into a story, what the brain will do is it will ignore it. So here's a practical example. Imagine you're at work and you grab your lunch and you go into the break room and you sit down at a table full of about 10 or 12 coworkers. And at the same time that you sit down, a coworker that you know who's sitting on the opposite end of the table just spontaneously gets up and walks off. Your brain is going to do one of two things with that information. It's either going to ignore it, saying that's a coincidence, or your brain is going to say, that person must have gotten up for a reason at the exact same time that I sat down. She must be angry at me still for the thing I said to her in the meeting this morning. So you see, our brain simply can't just take that information and do nothing with it. It either has to make up a story to make that information make sense to us, or it has to ignore it. So what does this mean for building your brand and crafting your message? Well, it means that if you're feeding your customers simply raw information, here's my product, buy it now, we have a sale. If you're not actually putting this in a format that our brains can digest, the format of a story, you're simply asking to be ignored. But the good news is that we know how to turn raw data into a compelling story, a story that makes sense for your brand, a story that you control instead of making your customers do the hard work of making up their own story. You can actually craft that story intentionally, and here is how. What is a good story to begin with? What are the components of any good story? Anything from Homer's Odyssey to the current modern day stories like Harry Potter or The Matrix or Moana. Every single good story, for the most part, follows a very predictable framework. And my friend Don Miller actually wrote an amazing book called Story Brand, and it unpacks the framework of every good story and actually explains how you can apply it to brands. Every single good story has to have a minimum of 4 components, and they're always the same. Number 1, every single good story has a central character who is a likable hero. That likable hero has to have a meaningful challenge presented to them in the story. Then they often meet a guide who helps them overcome that challenge. And component number 4, is at the end, the hero cannot end up being the same as they were in the beginning. So the hero must go through a transformation for the story to feel like it has a good ending. So those are the 4 components, and I'm simplifying this for sure. Those are the 4 major components of any good story. And here is how this applies to branding. So when you go back to those 4 components, who is the story's hero when it comes to your brand? Your hero is not your brand, and Don Miller talks about this in his book. Your hero is actually your audience. You're not the hero, your audience is the hero. Your audience has a unique challenge that you, as the brand, is positioned uniquely to solve, which makes you, not the hero, makes you the guide. And what you've got to do when you're building a great brand story is you've got to tell the story of how your hero, how your customer is going to be able to be transformed through your product, through your guidance. What is going to be different about their life after they've bought your product or signed up for your service? What's going to be different for them than it was before they found you? So let me give you an example of Airbnb. Airbnb does an amazing job of telling their brand story through this framework. So their hero is the customer who is an avid traveler who has a taste for adventure. What is their big challenge that Airbnb is solving? Well, their big challenge is that hotels are boring and stale and generic. And Airbnb, as the guide, opens up this unique, incredible world of personalized places where people can stay and feel like a local. So the transformation they're offering is they're saying, if you stay in a hotel, you'll feel like you're a tourist. You'll feel like you're staying in a generic room. If you stay at an Airbnb, we promise that you will feel like a local and you'll feel like you belong anywhere that you stay around the world as long as you use Airbnb. So Airbnb has chosen to tell the story of belonging, not the story of luxury, not the story of convenience, which happens to be an angle that other hotel chains do take. But for Airbnb, belonging is their thing and they own it. And that's the thing is, when you tell a brand story, it's got to be the same story. I think Tom Bilyeu said this really well. When a brand tells the same story from 1,000 different angles, then you start to mean something to the world. So it's not about just telling a story once in a while. It's about telling the same powerful story from 1,000 different angles so that people start to click, hey, this is the story of this brand and I know exactly how to engage with them. I encourage you to define your brand's story using the story brand framework. Go ahead and grab Don Miller's book. It's incredible. It's super informative. Figure out what is your brand story. How are you going to tell it from a lot of different angles? But make sure that it's the same consistent story, not just information that you're giving your audience, because raw information is never going to be digested into the brain as well as a great story will be. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. So this is actually part 1 of a 3-part series that I'm doing on storytelling. And next week, we're going to take a look at 3 brands that are mastering the art of storytelling, and we're going to just dive into the detail of how they tell the stories that they tell and why they work. And I hope that I'll give you some food for thought of how you can structure your own brand story. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would appreciate a thumbs up. And if you would like, subscribe to my channel for next week's video on the 3 brands that are mastering the art of storytelling. I'll see you soon.